The morning sun cast long shadows across the bustling newsroom of Channel 7 News. Sarah Martinez, a veteran news reporter with 15 years of experience, was preparing for what seemed like another routine assignment. Her camera operator, Mike Chen, was checking his equipment for the third time that morning. They had been assigned to cover a local community event in downtown Springfield, a small story that would barely make the evening news. Mike's camera had been acting up for weeks. The old Sony model had served them well for over 5 years, but lately it had been showing signs of wear. The zoom function occasionally stuck, and sometimes the recording would start or stop without warning. The news station's budget was tight, and new equipment requests had been denied repeatedly. Mike had learned to work around these issues, but today felt different. As they drove through the city streets toward the community center, Sarah reviewed her notes. The event was a simple ribbon-cutting ceremony for a new Veterans Memorial Park. Local politicians would speak, there would be a small crowd of families, and they would capture some footage for a feel-good segment. Nothing extraordinary was expected. The memorial park was located in an older part of the city, surrounded by aging buildings and narrow streets. When they arrived, Sarah noticed something unusual. Instead of the typical small gathering, there was a larger crowd than expected. Military veterans in uniform stood in formation, and several families had brought flowers and photographs of loved ones who had served. Mike began setting up his equipment, while Sarah approached the event organizers to get background information. As she spoke with the park committee chairman, she learned that this memorial had been 10 years in the making. The community had raised funds through bake sales, car washes, and small donations to honor local veterans who had made the ultimate sacrifice. Among the attendees was an elderly man sitting alone on a bench at the edge of the crowd. He wore a simple brown jacket and a worn baseball cap. His weathered hands held a small American flag, and his eyes seemed distant, focused on something beyond the ceremony taking place. Sarah noticed him but didn't think much of it at first. Veteran events always attracted older former servicemen who came to pay their respects. The ceremony began with the local high school band playing the national anthem. Mike positioned himself to capture the politicians cutting the ribbon, but as he adjusted his camera angle, the equipment started malfunctioning again. The viewfinder flickered, and the zoom began moving erratically. He tried to reset the system, but the camera seemed to have developed a mind of its own, unknown to Sarah and Mike. The elderly man on the bench was Thomas Harrison, a name that would mean nothing to most people but was legendary in certain military circles. 50 years earlier, Thomas had been one of the most skilled snipers in the Vietnam War. His precision and dedication had saved countless American lives, though his service records remained classified. After the war, he had returned home, started a family, and worked as a mechanic for 40 years, never speaking about his military service to anyone except his late wife. Thomas had come to the memorial dedication because his younger brother's name was engraved on the new monument. Danny Harrison had died in Afghanistan in 2003, and Thomas felt it was his duty to be present for the dedication. He hadn't told anyone he would be there, preferring to honor his brother's memory quietly and without attention. As Mike continued struggling with his malfunctioning camera, the device began recording intermittently without his knowledge. The lens, stuck in zoom mode, had focused on Thomas sitting alone on the bench. What Mike couldn't see through his flickering viewfinder was that his camera was capturing something remarkable, the raw emotion of a man confronting decades of memories he had buried deep inside. The ceremony continued with speeches from local officials and family members of fallen veterans. Each story shared added weight to the moment, and the crowd grew more emotional as names were read aloud. When Danny Harrison's name was announced, Thomas closed his eyes and gripped his small flag tighter. A single tear rolled down his weathered cheek, carrying with it 50 years of unspoken grief, pride, and sacrifice. Back at the news station, Mike and Sarah returned with what they thought was minimal footage due to the camera problems. The ceremony had been beautiful, but Mike was frustrated that his equipment had failed him during such an important community event. He explained to Sarah that the camera had been acting unpredictably, starting and stopping recording without his control. Sarah decided to review whatever footage they had managed to capture, hoping to salvage enough material for at least a brief segment on the evening news. She loaded the memory card into the editing station and began scrolling through the files. Most of the footage was shaky and unfocused, due to the camera malfunctions, but she was determined to find something usable. As she watched the choppy recordings, Sarah noticed several long segments that Mike hadn't intentionally filmed. The camera had apparently been recording while he thought it was off, capturing random moments throughout the ceremony. She was about to delete these accidental clips when something caught her attention. Among the unintentional footage was an extended recording of the elderly man on the bench. The camera's zoom malfunction had actually worked in their favor, providing a close-up view of Thomas that would have been impossible to achieve intentionally without being intrusive. Sarah watched as the man's expression changed throughout the ceremony, his eyes reflecting a depth of experience that spoke volumes without words. The most powerful moment came when Danny Harrison's name was read. Sarah watched as Thomas's composed demeanor cracked slightly, revealing raw emotion that had clearly been held back for years. The camera had captured not just his tears, but the way his entire body seemed to carry the weight of loss and memory. It was the kind of authentic human moment that news cameras rarely captured. Sarah called Mike over to watch the footage with her. Neither of them recognized Thomas, but they both understood they had stumbled upon something special. The accidental recording told a story more powerful than any planned interview could have achieved. It showed the real impact of war and loss on those who had served and those who had lost family members in service. However, Sarah faced an ethical dilemma. The footage had been captured without Thomas's knowledge or consent. While they had been filming at a public event, this particular recording felt deeply personal and private. The man clearly hadn't intended to be the subject of such intimate documentation. Using the footage without his permission seemed wrong, but the story it told was undeniably important. Mike suggested they try to find the man and ask for his permission to use the footage. They had captured something beautiful and meaningful, but they wanted to respect his privacy and dignity. Sarah agreed, and they decided to return to the memorial park the next day to see if they could locate him or find someone who knew him. That evening, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about the footage. She had covered hundreds of stories throughout her career, but something about this accidental recording felt different. The man's quiet dignity and obvious pain had created a powerful piece of visual storytelling. She wondered about his story, his connection to the memorial, and what experiences had shaped the emotions she had witnessed. The next morning, Sarah and Mike returned to the memorial park. They spoke with several people who had attended the ceremony, hoping someone might recognize the elderly man from their description. Most people remembered seeing him but didn't know who he was. The park committee chairman suggested they contact the local VFW post, as many veterans in the community were members there. At the VFW hall, they met with the post commander, a retired Navy veteran named Bill Rodriguez. When Sarah described the man they were looking for, Bill's expression changed. He knew exactly who they were talking about, but he seemed hesitant to share information. After some conversation, Bill revealed that the man was Thomas Harrison, a highly decorated Vietnam veteran who was extremely private about his military service. Bill explained that Thomas rarely talked about his time in Vietnam and had never sought recognition for his service. He was known in the community as a quiet, humble man who had worked hard to provide for his family and had volunteered countless hours helping other veterans adjust to civilian life. The only reason he had attended the memorial ceremony was because his younger brother's name was on the monument. Sarah realized they had accidentally captured footage of a man whose story represented thousands of veterans who had served with distinction but preferred to remain in the shadows. Thomas Harrison embodied the quiet heroism of those who had answered their country's call and then returned home to build normal lives without seeking glory or recognition. Bill Rodriguez provided Thomas Harrison's address, but made Sarah and Mike promise to approach him respectfully. He emphasized that Thomas was a very private person who had spent decades avoiding any attention related to his military service. Bill also mentioned that Thomas had lost his wife Emma 2 years earlier and had been struggling with loneliness since her passing. The next afternoon, Sarah and Mike drove to Thomas's modest home in a quiet residential neighborhood. The small house was well maintained but showed signs of being occupied by someone who lived alone. The front yard was neat with a small American flag displayed by the front door and a few flowers that appeared to be carefully tended. When Thomas answered the door, he looked surprised to see visitors. Sarah introduced herself and Mike, explaining that they were from Channel 7 News and had been covering the memorial ceremony. Thomas's expression immediately became guarded when he realized they were reporters. He had spent his entire adult life avoiding media attention and had no interest in changing that. Now, Sarah carefully explained how their camera had malfunctioned and accidentally captured footage of him during the ceremony. She emphasized that they hadn't intentionally filmed him and that they were seeking his permission before considering using any of the footage. Thomas listened quietly, his weathered face showing no emotion as Sarah described what they had recorded. When Sarah finished explaining, Thomas was silent for a long moment. He invited them inside, and they found themselves in a living room filled with family photographs but notably absent of any military memorabilia. The only hint of his service was a small shadow box on a bookshelf containing his Purple Heart and Bronze Star, almost hidden among family pictures. Thomas offered them coffee and sat down in his worn armchair. He asked to see the footage they had captured, wanting to understand exactly what they had recorded before making any decisions. Mike connected his camera to Thomas's television, and together they watched the accidental recording of the memorial ceremony. As Thomas watched himself on screen, his expression remained stoic, but Sarah could see the impact the footage had on him. Seeing his own grief displayed so openly was clearly difficult. When the recording reached the moment his brother's name was announced, Thomas quietly said, "That's my little brother Danny. He died in Afghanistan." Sarah and Mike remained silent, allowing Thomas to process what he had seen. After the footage ended, Thomas sat quietly for several minutes. Finally, he began to speak about Danny, describing him as a bright young man who had always looked up to his older brother and had joined the military following in Thomas's footsteps. Thomas explained that Danny had been killed by an improvised, explosive device while on patrol in Kandahar province. He had been 22 years old, the same age Thomas had been when he first arrived in Vietnam. The loss had devastated Thomas and Emma, but they had found comfort in knowing that Danny had died serving his country with honor. As Thomas shared these memories, Sarah began to understand the weight of what their camera had captured. The footage showed not just one man's grief, but the continuing cost of war on families and communities. Thomas's quiet dignity in the face of loss represented the strength and sacrifice of countless military families. Thomas asked why they wanted to use the footage, and Sarah explained that she believed his story could help people understand the real impact of military service on families. She thought the footage could honor not just Danny's memory, but the experiences of all veterans who had served and sacrificed. However, she emphasized that the decision was entirely his, and they would respect whatever choice he made. Thomas was torn between his natural inclination toward privacy and a growing recognition that sharing his story might serve a greater purpose. He had spent 50 years keeping his military experiences to himself, but he was also deeply committed to honoring veterans and their families. The memorial ceremony had reminded him of the importance of remembering those who had served and died. Mike showed Thomas how the footage could be edited respectfully, focusing on the emotional impact without exploiting his grief. They discussed the possibility of using his story to raise awareness about veterans' issues and the ongoing needs of military families. Thomas appreciated their sensitivity, but asked for time to consider their request. Sarah and Mike left their contact information and thanked Thomas for his time and consideration. As they drove away, both of them felt the weight of responsibility that came with their accidental discovery. They had stumbled upon a story that could have significant impact, but they were committed to telling it in a way that honored Thomas's dignity and his family's sacrifice. That evening, Thomas sat alone in his living room, staring at the shadow box containing his military decorations. He hadn't looked at them closely in years, preferring to keep those memories locked away. But Sarah and Mike's visit had stirred up feelings he had spent decades trying to manage. The accidental footage had forced him to confront not only his grief over Danny's death but also his own complicated relationship with his military service. Thomas picked up a photograph of Danny from the side table. It showed his younger brother in his army dress uniform, smiling broadly after completing basic training. Danny had been so proud to serve, so eager to follow in Thomas's footsteps. At the time, Thomas had felt honored by his brother's admiration, but after Danny's death, that pride had been mixed with guilt and regret. For the first time in years, Thomas allowed himself to think about his service in Vietnam. He had been an exceptional sniper, with confirmed kills that had saved numerous American lives during some of the war's most dangerous operations. His commanding officers had praised his skill and dedication, and his fellow soldiers had trusted him completely. But the precision that made him effective also made him acutely aware of the human cost of his actions. After returning from Vietnam, Thomas had never spoken about his specific role in the war. When people asked about his service, he would simply say he had done his duty and change the subject. Emma had been the only person who knew the full extent of his experiences, and even with her, he had shared his memories slowly and carefully over many years of marriage. The next morning, Thomas drove to the cemetery where both Emma and Danny were buried. Emma's grave was marked with a simple headstone that mentioned her roles as a loving wife and mother. Danny's military grave marker bore his rank, dates of service, and the inscription he gave his life for freedom. Thomas stood between the two graves, feeling the weight of his losses and the responsibility of carrying their memories forward. At Emma's grave, Thomas found himself speaking aloud for the first time since her funeral. He told her about the news reporters and their accidental footage, explaining his uncertainty about whether to share his story publicly. Emma had always been his moral compass, helping him navigate difficult decisions throughout their marriage. Although she couldn't answer him now, Thomas felt her presence and remembered her gentle wisdom. Emma had often encouraged Thomas to be more open about his experiences, believing that his story could help other veterans feel less alone. She had seen how he struggled with nightmares and guilt, and she had witnessed his gradual healing through volunteering with other veterans. Emma had always believed that Thomas's strength came not from keeping his experiences secret, but from using them to help others. That afternoon, Thomas visited the VFW hall and found Bill Rodriguez. The two men had known each other for years, and Bill had been one of the few people who understood Thomas's reluctance to discuss his military service. Bill had served in the Navy during Vietnam and had his own complicated relationship with that period of his life. Thomas told Bill about the news crew's request and his uncertainty about how to respond. Bill listened carefully and then shared his own perspective. He explained that many younger veterans returning from Iraq and Afghanistan struggled with the same issues Thomas had faced after Vietnam: difficulty adjusting to civilian life, survivor's guilt, and the challenge of processing traumatic experiences. Bill suggested that Thomas's story could provide hope and perspective for these younger veterans. Seeing an older veteran who had successfully built a meaningful life despite his struggles could be incredibly valuable for those still finding their way. Bill also pointed out that honoring Danny's memory through sharing their family's story might be exactly what Thomas needed to begin healing from his brother's loss. As Thomas considered Bill's words, he realized that his resistance to publicity wasn't just about protecting his privacy. He was also afraid of being judged for his actions during the war, or being seen as seeking attention for his service. The idea of being called a hero made him uncomfortable, because he had always viewed his military service as simply doing his job, nothing more or less than what was expected of him. However, Thomas also recognized that his perspective had been shaped by a different era, when veterans were often encouraged to keep their experiences private and move on with their lives. Younger veterans faced different challenges and might benefit from hearing about the long-term journey of processing military service and loss. That evening, Thomas called Sarah Martinez and asked if she and Mike could return to his home the next day. He had made his decision but wanted to establish clear boundaries about how his story would be told. Sarah was surprised and grateful for his call, agreeing immediately to meet with him again and promising to respect whatever conditions he set for sharing his story. When Sarah and Mike returned to Thomas's home, they found him more prepared and composed than during their first visit. He had spent the previous evening gathering photographs and documents that he felt comfortable sharing. On his coffee table were pictures of Danny throughout his life, from childhood through his military service, as well as some photos of Thomas and Emma together. Thomas began by explaining his decision to allow them to use the footage and tell his story. He emphasized that his primary motivation was honoring Danny's memory and potentially helping other veterans and military families. However, he had several conditions that were non-negotiable. He didn't want to be portrayed as a hero or have his specific military actions sensationalized. He preferred to focus on the human elements of military service and loss rather than combat details. Sarah and Mike readily agreed to Thomas's conditions, understanding that the most powerful aspects of his story were indeed the personal and emotional elements rather than military action. They were moved by his willingness to share such private experiences for the benefit of others, recognizing the courage it took for someone so private to open up to strangers. Thomas began telling them about Danny's childhood and their relationship as brothers. Despite their significant age difference, they had been very close. Thomas had essentially helped raise Danny after their father died, when Danny was only 10 years old. Thomas had been in his early 20s, recently returned from Vietnam, and had stepped into a paternal role while their mother worked 2 jobs to support the family. As Thomas shared these memories, his guarded demeanor gradually softened. He showed them pictures of teaching Danny to fish, helping him with homework, and attending his high school graduation. When Danny expressed interest in joining the military, Thomas had felt both pride and concern. He was proud that Danny looked up to him and wanted to serve his country. But he also understood the realities of military service in ways that Danny couldn't. Thomas described Danny's excitement about enlisting and his determination to make a difference in Afghanistan. Danny had believed strongly in the mission and had written letters home describing his unit's efforts to help Afghan communities and train local security forces. His enthusiasm and optimism had reminded Thomas of his own feelings when he first deployed to Vietnam, before the harsh realities of war had tempered his idealism. When Thomas received the news of Danny's death, he had been working in his auto repair shop. 2 Army officers had arrived at his workplace, and Thomas had known immediately why they were there. The official notification process was professional and compassionate, but nothing could have prepared him for the finality of losing his younger brother. Emma had been devastated, and Thomas had struggled to support her while managing his own grief. The funeral had been difficult for Thomas in unexpected ways. The military honors, flag presentation, and ceremonial aspects had brought back memories of Vietnam that he had kept buried for decades. Seeing Danny's young face in his military portrait had reminded Thomas of all the young soldiers he had known who never came home from his own war. The grief for Danny became mixed with delayed grief for comrades he had lost 40 years earlier. Sarah and Mike listened carefully as Thomas shared these deeply personal memories. They could see how difficult it was for him to discuss these experiences, but they also sensed his relief at finally having someone to tell. Emma had been his primary confidant, and since her death he had carried these burdens alone. Thomas also talked about his struggles after Emma's death 2 years earlier. Losing her had been devastating not only because of their love for each other, but because she had been his anchor to civilian life and his primary source of emotional support. Without her, he had begun to feel isolated and had found it harder to manage the memories and emotions he had kept controlled for so many years. As the interview continued, Thomas revealed more about his current life and his volunteer work with other veterans. He had quietly helped dozens of younger veterans adjust to civilian life, offering practical support and understanding based on his own experiences. Many of these veterans had no idea about Thomas's military background or decorations. They simply knew him as someone who understood their struggles and offered genuine help without judgment. Mike captured additional footage of Thomas in his workshop, showing him working on an old car engine with the same precision and focus he had once applied to more deadly pursuits. The contrast between his current peaceful life and his military past created a powerful visual narrative about the possibility of healing and moving forward while still carrying the weight of service and loss. Sarah realized that Thomas's story represented something much larger than one family's sacrifice. His journey from combat veteran to grieving brother to quiet helper of other veterans illustrated the complex, ongoing nature of military service's impact on individuals and families. His willingness to share his story, despite his natural privacy, demonstrated the kind of selfless service that had characterized his entire adult life. Sarah and Mike spent the following week carefully crafting Thomas's story for broadcast. They reviewed hours of footage and interview material, working to create a narrative that honored Thomas's wishes while capturing the emotional power of his experiences. The accidental footage from the memorial ceremony served as the centerpiece, but they surrounded it with context that helped viewers understand the depth of Thomas's journey. The final piece opened with scenes from the memorial dedication, gradually focusing on Thomas sitting alone on the bench. Sarah's narration explained how a camera malfunction had led to an unexpected discovery about one attendee, whose presence at the ceremony carried special significance. The story then transitioned to Thomas's own words about Danny and their relationship as brothers. Rather than sensationalizing Thomas's military service, the segment focused on the human elements of his story. It showed photographs of Danny growing up, Thomas's description of their close relationship, and the impact of Danny's death on their family. The piece also included footage of Thomas in his workshop and brief glimpses of his volunteer work with other veterans, illustrating how he had channeled his experiences into helping others. The story aired on a Thursday evening as the lead segment of the local news. Sarah had informed Thomas of the broadcast time, and he had decided to watch it at home alone. As he saw himself on television for the first time, he felt a mixture of anxiety and strange relief. The story was respectful and dignified, exactly as Sarah had promised it would be. The response to the broadcast was immediate and overwhelming. Within an hour of the story airing, the news station began receiving phone calls and emails from viewers who had been moved by Thomas's story. Many were veterans or military family members who recognized their own experiences in his journey. Others were simply community members who wanted to express their gratitude for his service and their sympathy for his losses. By the next morning, the story had been shared hundreds of times on social media, and other news outlets were requesting permission to use portions of the segment. Sarah was careful to check with Thomas before granting any of these requests, respecting his wishes about how widely his story was shared. Thomas was surprised by the positive response, but grateful that people seemed to understand the message he had hoped to convey. One of the most meaningful responses came from a group of Afghanistan veterans who contacted the news station asking to meet Thomas. These younger veterans had seen themselves in his story and wanted to thank him for sharing his experiences. They also hoped to learn from someone who had successfully navigated the long-term challenges of processing military service and loss. Thomas agreed to meet with several of these veterans at the VFW Hall, where Bill Rodriguez arranged a small gathering. The meeting was informal and emotional, with Thomas finding himself in the unexpected role of elder statesman and mentor. The younger veterans asked him about managing nightmares, dealing with survivor's guilt, and finding purpose in civilian life. Thomas answered their questions honestly, sharing strategies that had helped him over the decades. During these conversations, Thomas realized that his decision to share his story was already having the impact he had hoped for. These younger veterans felt less alone in their struggles after hearing about his journey, and Thomas found new purpose in being able to help them based on his own experiences. The connection between different generations of veterans created a sense of continuity and mutual support that benefited everyone involved. News story also prompted several unexpected developments in Thomas's personal life. Old friends and acquaintances who had lost touch with him over the years reached out after seeing the broadcast. Some were former military colleagues who had wondered what happened to him after the war, while others were community members who had known him for years without understanding his military background. Perhaps most surprisingly, Thomas heard from other veterans who had similarly kept their service experiences private for decades. Several of these men and women contacted him to share their own stories and to thank him for giving them courage to be more open about their experiences. Thomas began to understand that his decision to share his story had created ripple effects he had never anticipated. The local VFW post saw an increase in membership applications following the broadcast, as several veterans in the community decided to become more involved with veteran organizations. Bill Rodriguez credited Thomas's story with helping to break down some of the barriers that prevented veterans from seeking support and community with their peers. 2 weeks after the story aired, Thomas received a letter from the family of another veteran whose brother had died in Afghanistan. They had seen his story and wanted to thank him for helping them feel less alone in their grief. The letter described how difficult it had been to talk about their loss, and how seeing Thomas's dignity and strength had encouraged them to seek support from other military families in their community. 6 months after the story aired, Thomas's life had changed in ways he never could have anticipated. What began as an accidental recording had evolved into something much larger than anyone had expected. Thomas found himself regularly visiting the VFW Hall, not just for his own needs but to help coordinate support programs for younger veterans transitioning to civilian life. The informal mentorship that began after the broadcast had grown into a structured program. Thomas worked with Bill Rodriguez and other veteran leaders to create a peer support network that paired older veterans with younger ones returning from Iraq and Afghanistan. Thomas's workshop became an unofficial gathering place where veterans could work on projects together while talking through their experiences in a relaxed, supportive environment. Sarah continued to follow Thomas's story, checking in with him periodically to see how he was adjusting to his newfound visibility. She was amazed by how much he had embraced his role as a mentor and advocate for other veterans. The man who had spent decades avoiding attention had become one of the most effective voices for veteran support in the community. Thomas had also developed an unexpected friendship with Mike, the camera operator whose malfunctioning equipment had started everything. Mike visited Thomas's workshop regularly, sometimes bringing his own son to learn basic auto repair skills. The relationship had grown beyond their professional connection, with Mike becoming one of Thomas's closest friends and confidants. The memorial park where everything began had become a special place for Thomas. He visited regularly, not just to honor Danny's memory but to meet with other families who had lost loved ones in military service. The park had evolved into an informal gathering place for the military community, and Thomas often found himself providing comfort and support to newly grieving families. Particularly meaningful development was Thomas's decision to finally seek counseling for his own military experiences. Inspired by his work with younger veterans and encouraged by the positive response to sharing his story, Thomas began working with a therapist who specialized in helping older veterans process long-delayed trauma. This decision represented a significant breakthrough for someone who had spent 50 years managing his experiences alone. Through therapy, Thomas began to understand that his guilt over surviving Vietnam while others didn't was connected to his grief over Danny's death. He realized that his reluctance to discuss his military service had been partly rooted in survivor's guilt that he had never properly addressed. Working through these feelings helped him become an even more effective mentor for other veterans struggling with similar issues. The news story had also prompted changes at Channel 7 News. Sarah and Mike's experience with Thomas led the station to develop a regular segment focusing on veteran issues and stories. They established relationships with local veteran organizations and began producing monthly features that highlighted both the challenges and successes of military families in their community. Thomas's story had a particularly powerful impact on the station's approach to journalism. The accidental nature of the original footage served as a reminder that some of the most important stories emerge unexpectedly, requiring sensitivity and patience rather than aggressive pursuit. Sarah often used Thomas's story as an example when training younger reporters about the importance of building trust with sources and respecting people's dignity while telling their stories. As the one-year anniversary of the memorial dedication approached, Thomas was asked to speak at the ceremony. Initially hesitant about public speaking, he agreed after realizing that his words might help other families processing loss and grief. His brief speech focused on the ongoing nature of military service's impact on families and communities, emphasizing that honoring fallen service members requires supporting their survivors and fellow veterans. During his speech, Thomas acknowledged that sharing his story had been difficult but ultimately healing. He encouraged other veterans to find ways to connect with their peers and to seek help when needed. His words carried special weight because everyone present knew about his own journey from private grief to public advocacy. The memorial ceremony concluded with Thomas placing flowers at Danny's name on the monument. But this time he wasn't alone. He was surrounded by dozens of veterans and military families who had found community and support through the connections that began with an accidental recording. The image of Thomas surrounded by this supportive community provided a powerful contrast to the footage of him sitting alone on the bench 1 year earlier. In quiet moments, Thomas often reflected on how Emma would have felt about the changes in his life. He believed she would have been proud of his decision to help other veterans and to finally share their family's story. The work he was doing with younger veterans had given him a sense of purpose that honored both Emma's memory and Danny's sacrifice. The broken camera that started everything had been retired and replaced, but Mike kept it in his office as a reminder that sometimes the most important stories come from unexpected places. Thomas's story had taught everyone involved that healing and connection often emerge from our willingness to be vulnerable and share our experiences with others, even when it feels frightening or uncomfortable.